You're listening to the download edition of World Business Report for Monday the 9th of February. I'm Marie Keyworth. HSBC finds itself in hot water over the actions of its private banking business.
It shows really that the bank was working with clients, or at least ignoring clients that were avoiding taxes. And also they weren't necessarily being very careful with the clientele that they were taking into the bank.
Indian growth figures are looking good, but possibly a little too good.
If you look at the new figures, technically India grew faster than China between October and December. But no one is really ready to believe or buy that story.
We get the latest from a big mining conference in South Africa, and who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Well, not people who live in straw houses.
They work extremely well. In fact, we built a whole prototype two-storey house, and we subjected it to what we eventually termed the big bad wolf test.
But first, how far is too far when it comes to helping a client? For the bank HSBC, they may have been offering one helping hand too many. An investigation by the International Committee of Investigative Journalists says that the global banking giant profited from doing business with arms dealers, traffickers and blood diamonds and what it calls other international outlaws. The BBC has been looking into the British aspect of the case and found evidence that the bank's private banking arm, based in Switzerland, had helped customers avoid paying millions of dollars in tax. Gerald Ryle is the director of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. He told me about the global findings.
These are documents on their clientele and also the amounts of money. But further than that, it's actually a list of notes that were made by the bank employees on the clients, and that's actually very revealing.
And what has been revealed by all this?
Well, it shows really that the bank was, should we say, working with clients, or at least ignoring clients that were avoiding taxes. And also they weren't necessarily being very careful with the clientele that they were taking into the bank.
It suggested that, in fact, they were helping their clients find ways to protect their money from taxation.
Well, in fact, they were going further than that. The bank was marketing products that would allow their clients to avoid tax. And in particular, there was a lot of back and forth in the notes back in 2005 when a thing called the European Savings Directive came in. And that was basically a way that Europe was trying to stop people avoiding tax. But it was levied only on individuals, and what the bank was doing was marketing a product that allowed the bank accounts to become owned, nominally at least, by a company in, say, the British Virgin Islands or Panama, or instead of the individual themselves, in which case they didn't have to report it.
And this had a vast scale, didn't it?
There were clients from more than 200 countries in the files that we saw, and we know that already that these files are now being used by authorities in various countries, including Britain, to claw back taxes that should have been paid. And we know just from three countries, which is Spain, France and Britain, that about $800 million has already been recovered.
As a direct result of the information from this. But how did you come by the information? This kind of thing isn't normally public knowledge. That's why it's caused such a stir now we're finding out about it.
Well, these were files that were stolen by a former employee of the bank back in 2008, and they were handed over to the French authorities that year. After the French authorities investigated the names, they started sharing these files with various governments, including the British government, from about 2010. We got the material from reporters at Le Monde newspaper in France, who in turn got it from sources inside the French authorities.
And how serious are these allegations? Because in the UK, at least, having a Swiss bank account isn't something that's illegal. You're allowed to do that. So in that sense, it doesn't necessarily mean, surely, that by having one of these accounts, you've been doing anything wrong.
No, that's a very good point to make. In fact, just owning a bank account is not in itself illegal. But in these file notes, there was a lot of evidence of illegal behaviour, and clearly the authorities have now used these files to prosecute people.
And it's not just tax avoidance that's really been brought out by this, is it? Because it seems that HSBC had the accounts of people involved in the more unsavoury side of business, for instance, arms dealers and traffickers in blood diamonds.
Yeah, there were a lot of clients of the bank. You would have thought that the bank wouldn't want them to have them as clients. And in fact, after we put our findings to the bank, they admitted that they no longer have these people as clients. In fact, they said that they've got rid of 70% of their clients from the Swiss branch since 2008.
Gerald Ryle there. Now, news of HSBC's actions has struck a chord the world over. Many of the bank's clients implicated in the investigation are based in other countries, including Egypt, Russia and India. Among them are celebrities and politicians. Stephen Platt advises businesses and governments and the World Bank on issues of financial crime. He told me from an industry-wide perspective, he's not surprised by the revelations.
This is one scandal in a very long line of scandals, and the idea that HSBC is some sort of rogue financial institution operating out on a limb from the rest of the mainstream banking community, I think is complete nonsense. It's very important that we stop, as it were, reporting these scandals in isolation and realise that they are all, as it were, on a spectrum of appalling conduct, ranging not just from the excessive risk-taking that led us all to the brink in 2008, but rate rigging, mis-selling scandals, sanctions evasion scandals, money laundering, and this latest one involving HSBC involves alleged facilitation of tax evasion. But I don't think anybody should be surprised given the news that's emerged about conduct within the banking industry over the course of the last 10 years.
So why then is this causing such a massive newsflash around the world?
Well, I can't really answer that. I mean, clearly there has been a massively increased emphasis on tax evasion during this period of sort of unprecedented economic austerity. Governments are looking to recover as much money as they possibly can, and there's been a global crackdown on tax avoidance and tax evasion, and rightly so. But as I say, the idea that HSBC is on its own here is I think delusional. There is an entire industry which is devoted to assisting people to avoid / evade paying tax, whether that's banks, accountancy firms, law firms, trust and corporate services providers, and so on. And this is an industry which is still very, very buoyant, very active, very profitable, operating all around the world. And I think what is really important and what is being missed in all of this is that whatever HSBC was doing in Switzerland was legitimate in Switzerland. And the reason that they were doing it in Switzerland is because for years now, in stark contrast to the position which has been adopted in the UK and many of its territories, it has not been illegal in Switzerland to launder the proceeds of foreign tax evasion. And we criminalised that sort of activity in the UK, even in places like Jersey and the Isle of Man. That they criminalised that activity, but in Switzerland they didn't. And in the process, they attracted a huge amount of business that those jurisdictions no longer wanted to do. And so, I think if you know anything about this area, you wouldn't be surprised by the revelations coming out of Switzerland.
And it's very tricky as well, isn't it? Because if we're talking about different national jurisdictions, even something like tax evasion and tax avoidance means different things and has different legal ramifications.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I mean, traditionally, the distinction between them was pretty clear, and it was always, as it were, the difference between them was the thickness of a prison wall. There is an industry which is dedicated to identifying loopholes in tax codes and tax laws in order to assist people to mitigate their liability to paying tax. The idea that people and corporations want to pay a penny more in tax than they're obliged to do is a nonsense. From the world's largest corporations through to high net worth individuals, everybody is looking to reduce or minimise their liability to tax.
Now, all this information, this relates to accounts being held in 2006 and 2007. Now, HSBC say that standards are higher now than what they were back then.
Well, I can't comment on what the standards are at HSBC because I'm not at all close to it. From my own knowledge of the banking industry, I think standards have changed. I think that there are generally more rigorous controls that are designed to prevent this kind of activity from taking place.
That's Stephen Platt there. Now, things are looking good for the Indian economy.
Petrol prices have gone lower. So my budget, my cash in hand is balanced with me, like I have more to spend. Spending power has increased now, and even on the day-to-day needs also I find it's ease on my budget. Earlier, like I would exhaust that and it would be like making both ends meet, it was difficult for me.
Well, that's one happy customer there, and this newfound optimism seems to be reflected in the latest economic growth figures for India. They show a country that experienced an impressive boom in the last year. But things may not be quite as they seem. India's statisticians have reworked the way they calculate the GDP figures, which could have given the economy a bit of an unnatural boost. Earlier I spoke to the BBC's Samir Hashmi, who's in Mumbai.
The figures that have been released are revised figures based on this new method which the Statistics Ministry has come up with to measure the economy. The revised numbers say that Indian economy grew between October to December period at about 7.5%. And for this whole year, they estimate, the financial year which will end in March 2015, that the economy would have grown by 7.4%. In fact, they've also revised the growth rate for the previous financial year to 6.9% from 4.7%.
So should these figures then be taken with a pinch of salt if the way that they've been calculated has changed?
Well, this is what all economists here believe, because frankly speaking, everyone's baffled here. And it's not only economists, even the government is. The reason for that is that the Indian economy, all this while, the perception was that it has been struggling. There is a slack in the economy, and under the new government of Narendra Modi, it's trying to really revive. But if you look at the new figures, technically India grew faster than China between October and December. But no one is really ready to believe or buy that story. Just to explain you the change, what has really changed? They've changed a lot of things which were not taken into account earlier. Just to give you a small example, a lot of sectors and segments were underrepresented. For example, mobile phones, smartphones, LED TVs were not taken into account. Now they'll be taken into account. People are saying that these changes are in line with global standards, but they're still not sure whether these are credible numbers or not, just because there's such a sharp jump.
So even if these specific numbers aren't necessarily credible, is there a sense that the new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, in his 10 months in office, is actually turning India around? His changes and reforms are actually making a difference?
Well, the perception at least is changing. Whether you talk to foreign investors, consumers, or even businesses, they feel that the government is making the right noises. They are trying to bring in positive reforms that's really going to help the economy. But a lot of them expect the government to do much more, because there are still a lot of, let's say, loopholes in the economy, and that needs to be fixed. But businesses are optimistic that the economy would turn around and India would start growing really fast going ahead. In fact, I spoke to one of the leading painting companies in the country. It's called Narolac. I spoke to the chief executive, Mr. H.M. Baruka, and he sounded very positive, and this is what he told me.
So we are expecting, the consumption to grow faster than what it was in the previous year. Coupled with this, now when government is talking about smart cities, right, housing for all, I think we see a great future.
So that was Mr. H.M. Baruka, Chief Executive of Narolac Paints. Basically, now everyone's looking forward to the annual budget, which will be unveiled at the end of this month. And everyone thinks that that's where the government is going to make some big announcements, give a direction really to the economy as to what it plans to do over the next 3 to 4 years to make India a vibrant economy and to ensure that it keeps growing at a fast pace over the next decade or so.
The BBC's Samir Hashmi there talking to me from Mumbai. Now you're listening to World Business Report from the BBC World Service, and still to come, praise for your boss, it's okay, but not on the internet, please.
Mr. Rusbridger, by most accounts, was a great editor, and he could play the piano pretty well too. But tweets are a vulgar way of saying so, and don't even necessarily prove their point.
That's more from Lucy Kellaway later. But first, let's have a look at what's happening on the financial markets today. Jeremy Batstone-Carr from Stockbrokers Charles Stanley joins me now. And we're going to talk about Greece, because whenever the new Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras, opens his mouth, it seems that something happens. And I believe today he did indeed open his mouth once more.
Hi, Marie. Yes, well, he actually opened his mouth yesterday evening, Sunday evening. He addressed the Greek Parliament in an impassioned speech within which he essentially refuted the suggestion that Greece would back down from its aggressive position taken since the election, that it would row back on austerity, increase the minimum wage, increase the number of jobs, etc., despite the fact that on his tour of Europe, the European institutions, European leaders told him unequivocally that there was huge risk in pursuing this path. How did the markets react? Greek stocks and Greek banking stocks tanked, the cost of Greek borrowing soared, and we saw weakness in the other peripheral European markets and indeed at the core too.
Also, looking where we've seen a few changes is in the oil price. We get used to a situation where it's at a new low and it's been rising again.
It has indeed. The oil price has been moving higher, somewhat slowly. A week or so ago, we were talking about $40, $45 a barrel. It's now up in the mid-50s. Indeed, the price of a barrel of Brent crude is close to $60 a barrel. Nobody's getting particularly perturbed about that yet. $45 to $60 seen very much as the Goldilocks sweet spot. If we go north of 60, I'm just wondering whether some of those optimistic economic forecasts may have to be pared back a bit.
Jeremy Batsinker, thank you very much. And just for a quick look at the latest figures in the markets, in London, the 100 share index is down 0.2% at 6837. And in New York just now, the Dow is down 0.3% at 17,771. Now you're listening to the BBC World Service, the world's radio station. And hello to our listeners in Port of Spain, Trinidad, on 98.7 FM. And good evening to you in Jerusalem, listening on medium wave 1323 kilohertz. Now, executives and investors involved in the mining industry in Africa are rubbing shoulders this week in the South African city of Cape Town. It's the annual chance for the players to glance back and look forward at the sector, which has saw much turmoil in 2014. Matthew Davies, who's editor of the BBC's Africa Business Report, is at the conference, and I spoke to him earlier.
Normally, tourists flock here to take in the delights of things like Table Mountain, Camps Bay, the famous wine areas, which are just a short drive away. But this week, thousands involved in the mining industry in Africa descend on the city. Chief executives, fund managers and ministers from many African countries come here to chat and talk about the issues surrounding the industry. And one of the big issues this year, of course, is the commodity metals prices falling. And they've been falling for about a year. Iron ore, coal and especially copper. They've all been falling, and it's down mainly to this decreasing demand. You've got Europe remaining subdued and China bringing in some weaker export numbers. And of course, we saw recently that the Chinese economy grew by just 7.4% in 2014. Very enviable if you're the United States or Europe, but for China, that's a bit of a cooling down. So the figures show commodity prices are at their lowest level for 12 years.
And what about Ebola? Is that being discussed at all? Because obviously that's having a huge effect on the mining industry in the affected countries in West Africa.
Millions of dollars have been lost because of the outbreak of the deadly virus of Ebola in West Africa. Mines in Sierra Leone, Liberia and Guinea were shut. Rio Tinto and ArcelorMittal, the iron ore and steel giant, they put their expansion plans on hold, and a firm called London Mining went into administration. They were an iron ore miner in Sierra Leone, and actually they were one of Sierra Leone's largest employers, and some say contributed as much as 10% to the country's GDP. Now, all of this, of course, meant that the Ebola virus isolated these countries, so the ports and the borders were shut, and basically little got in and little got out. And the skilled foreigners who were working on the mines, they became repatriated. I mean, other companies donated money to fight against Ebola, and others still put procedures in place very rapidly. Now, Randgold Resources has gold mines in Mali, Senegal and Ivory Coast, not in the badly affected countries. But the CEO, Mark Bristow, told me that they had reacted quickly and properly.
We led a private industry working group which partnered with the regional governments as well as specifically in Mali when it had those two imported cases. The Ebola crisis became a crisis because it was neglected for so long before people owned up to the fact that they had Ebola. You know, we have Ebola regularly in the DRC. The DRC authorities know how to deal with it, and it doesn't even make the headlines anymore.
Mark Bristow there, ending that report from the BBC's Matt Davies in Cape Town.
Number one was very gay, and he built his house with hay. With a hey, hey toot, he blew on his flute, and he played around all day.
It's an age-old lesson, one that's been around long before 1933, when Henry Hall and the BBC Dance Orchestra performed this snappy little song.
Lady pigs. Number three said nix on tricks. I will build my house with bricks.
We've always learnt, don't build your house out of hay or sticks. Surround yourself with the solidity of brick, or you risk becoming food for a passing wolf.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf, big bad wolf.
But now it looks like we'll have to rethink everything we thought we knew, because straw is back and the first houses made out of straw bales are going on sale in the UK this month. And because they're certified, now you can get a mortgage for them. To find out why anyone on earth would want to buy a house built of straw, I spoke to Professor Peter Walker from the University of Bath, who's been developing the homes.
The reason for using straw, particularly in Northern Europe, is it provides excellent thermal insulation, so you get reduced energy bills. Secondly, the fabric, the materials that you use, the straw has a lower carbon dioxide emissions than manufactured building materials like masonry or concrete. And as a plant-based material, then through the natural process of photosynthesis, then it actually removes atmospheric carbon dioxide and stores it within its fabric. And as a result, it becomes a carbon store. And the material itself is relatively low cost as well. So I think it's affordable, it's sustainable, and it provides healthy, safe, energy-efficient buildings.
So these buildings are obviously very environmentally friendly, but what are they like to live in? If I walked past one, would I see bits of hay bale poking out of the sides? And when it comes to things like fire resistance and weather resistance,
Sure.
are these nice houses to live in?
Absolutely. How they look very much depends upon the architecture and the client who's built them, but for example, the buildings we're involved in don't look like straw bale building. The straw is not evident, and that's one of the successes. The process is about making prefabricated wall panels in a factory and delivering the panels to site, which makes them much more acceptable to the construction industry. So they're not, if you like, deep green and hairy, but they are a modern, slick, manufactured construction product.
But do they last? I mean, a lot of people would want to buy a house as an asset, something that they're going to perhaps pass down the generations, something that will be with them at least for their lives. If it's made out of straw and you're getting a loan out based on the value of this house, is it not going to blow away after a few years?
No, not at all. I mean, that's part of the research that we've been involved in. So, for example, in structural performance as a frame product, they work extremely well. In fact, we built a whole prototype two-storey house, and we subjected it to what we eventually termed the Big Bad Wolf test. We imposed a simulated hurricane wind load on it by applying hydraulic jacks off a frame, and the house passed the test with flying colours. The panels have recently received a UK certification as a construction product, which means they have been recognised by a third-party certifier as being fit for use in modern construction.
So for anyone who's worried out there, these buildings are wolf-proof then?
Absolutely. In fact, when we did the structural test on the whole house, the researcher couldn't resist the opportunity to go down the local fancy dress store and hire a wolf suit, and was there dressed as a wolf trying to blow the house over.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf, big bad wolf. Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? La 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 la.
A song, and Professor Pete Walker ending that there. Now, when a company boss departs for pastures new, it becomes increasingly standard for colleagues to take to social media to offer their eulogistic praise. But is this all becoming a little unsavoury, especially when the boss's successor has yet to be decided? Lucy Kellaway of the Financial Times has her own typically outspoken thoughts.
In 1990, when I had been at the FT only a shortish time, the then editor resigned. I liked him. He'd been kind to me and I was sorry to see him go. But I was also very junior and had a proper horror of brown nosing. Should I write him a letter, I wondered, or would that be unseemly? Since then, the world has speeded up, so any response happens not in weeks but in minutes. It's also gone social. We no longer address our words of farewell to the person concerned, but to everyone with an internet connection. And most remarkable of all, somewhere along the way, our aversion to brown nosing has got lost. When Alan Rusbridger recently resigned as editor of The Guardian in London, eulogies began almost at once on Twitter, with staff falling over themselves to declare publicly that few people in the history of journalism have had the vision or talent of Alan Rusbridger or could play the piano as well. A great editor, one said. Mr. Rusbridger, by most accounts, was a great editor, and he could play the piano pretty well too. But tweets are a vulgar way of saying so, and don't even necessarily prove their point. Even in the pre-internet age, there was never a particularly strong link between public declarations of praise from interested parties and a person's true value. When King Lear decided it was time to carve up his kingdom, he asked his daughters how much they loved him. "Sir, I do love you more than words can wield the matter," said Regan, which Goneril trumped by saying she loved him just as much, and then some. I couldn't help thinking of the warring sisters when I read the competing tweets from two of the most hotly tipped successors to Mr. Rusbridger. First to declare her love for the departing editor was Janine Gibson. "Alan Rusbridger, once-in-a-generation editor, best boss ever, good at surprises," she tweeted. Her rival for the job, Catherine Viner, followed suit with her paean in 140 characters or fewer. "Alan Rusbridger, for 17 years my inspiring editor, never afraid, always pushing us to be bigger, bolder, braver." An even more powerful objection to tweeted eulogies is that a legacy is more properly judged in years than in seconds. This was brought home to me the other day during a book sale in my office. As colleagues scrambled for bargains, I noticed that being trampled underfoot was a sad copy of the book written by a man who received more instant plaudits than any I can remember when he quit his job 3 years ago. Last week, there were no takers for Terry Leahy's Why I'm So Great management memoir, even with the price slashed by 95%. Given that Tesco is halfway down the tubes, partly as a result of Mr. Leahy's dodgy legacy, demand is bound to be limited for his homilies on the importance of truth, loyalty and courage. Even the title, Management in 10 Words, now seems like a blatant case of mis-selling. It's management in 312, somewhat discredited, pages. This is Lucy Kellaway for the BBC World Service.
Always honest there, Lucy. Don't forget you can get a podcast online of this programme at the BBC Business pages. That's it for World Business Report.
You've been listening to World Business Report from the BBC World Service. For more news and analysis, download Business Matters, our daily hour-long mix of current affairs and debate, published at breakfast time in Asia and Europe. We debate key trends in the worlds of work, politics, technology and the environment. Find it at bbc.com/podcasts. You can also follow us and get our latest audio at twitter.com/BBC World Biz and talk to us on Facebook at facebook.com/BBC Business.
You're listening to the download edition of World Business Report for Monday the 9th of February. I'm Marie Keyworth. HSBC finds itself in hot water over the actions of its private banking business.
It shows really that the bank was working with clients, or at least ignoring clients that were avoiding taxes. And also they weren't necessarily being very careful with the clientele that they were taking into the bank.
Indian growth figures are looking good, but possibly a little too good.
If you look at the new figures, technically India grew faster than China between October.
National Committee of Investigative Journalists says that the global banking giant profited from doing business with arms dealers, traffickers and blood diamonds and what it calls other international outlaws. The BBC has been looking into the British aspect of the case and found evidence that the bank's private banking arm, based in Switzerland, had helped customers avoid paying millions of dollars in tax. Gerald Ryle is the director of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. He told me about the global findings.
These are documents on their clientele and also the amounts of money. But further than that, it's actually a list of notes that were made by the bank employees on the clients, and that's actually very revealing.
And what has been revealed by all this?
Well, it shows really that the bank was, should we say, working with clients, or at least ignoring clients that were avoiding taxes. And also they weren't necessarily being very careful with the clientele that they were taking into the bank.
It suggested that, in fact, they were helping their clients find ways to protect their money from taxation.
Well, in fact, they were going further than that. The bank was marketing products that would allow their clients to avoid tax. And in particular, there was a lot of back and forth in the notes back in 2005 when a thing called the European Savings Directive came in. And that was basically a way that Europe was trying to stop people avoiding tax. but it was levied only on individuals. And what the bank was doing was marketing a product that allowed the bank accounts to become owned, nominally at least, by a company in, say, the British Virgin Islands or Panama, or instead of the...
in December. But no one is really ready to believe or buy that story.
We get the latest from a big mining conference in South Africa, and who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Well, not people who live in straw houses.
They work extremely well. In fact, we built a whole prototype 2-storey house, and we subjected it to what we eventually termed the big bad wolf test.
But first, how far is too far when it comes to helping a client? For the bank HSBC, they may have been offering one helping hand too many. An investigation by the